Joining me again, as always, David Hawkins. David, how are you?
I'm very well, Jason. Thanks for having me on the show.
Back again for some reverse engineering of crime scene investigations. David, your show has become one of the most fascinating and anticipated shows on Crowdsource The Truth. One of the things that I appreciate about it is when we first met, you were talking about a lot of the same things that we continue to talk about, but the repetition and the further investigation has made these once seemingly esoteric concepts more clear than they had been. And I really like that because people are so prone to just dismiss something that they don't understand. But I've just become more and more fascinated by these concepts, and I've noticed mainstream reporting and other sources that absolutely back up the things that you've been talking about.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I have to tell you, Jason, that I discover things actually on the show live. You know, like there was that fascinating time a few weeks ago where you put up the particular incarnation, if that's the right word, of the Federal Bridge that we're looking at up on the screen, and that was different and fundamentally different from the one that I'd looked at originally when I was identifying the use of the Federal Bridge in the 9/11 attack. Mm-hmm. And just to summarize, on the Federal Bridge model of 2001 showed two banks, which this particular one does not show. And the two banks were Wells Fargo and Citibank. And of course, in 2001, Wells Fargo, very important, and Americans haven't really recognized that or understood the implications of it. The Wells Fargo had the leveraged lease on the Twin Towers. And what the leveraged lease means is there's I often get confused. I think the lessor is the sort of the parent, and the lessee is the party that leases from the lessor. And in the particular case of the Twin Towers, Wells Fargo put together a debt cartel of about $3.4 billion, I believe, to buy the 99-year lease on the two buildings from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Mm-hmm. With Larry Silverstein popping in $40 million, which is actually chump change in the greater scheme of things. A lot of Americans don't know that they have a former president who was an expert in leverage leases and currency swaps, a guy by the name of Barack Hussein Obama.
Right.
So that leverage lease paid off in spades because the lessor, that is the master server of that leverage lease, Wells Fargo, was able to double the insurance on the Twin Towers in the event both came down in the same day, 6 weeks before they did. So there was a lot of money in that. Then this other thing, if you go back to the previous version of the Federal Bridge, you'll see off on the left something really, really interesting that I hadn't, like I said, sometimes I discover things actually on the show or immediately afterwards. You see that top left-hand blob called Safe Bridge?
Yes.
That's, I think it's security for everyone is what SAFE stands for, and it's for the biopharma industry. So it has companies like, well, I don't think Apotex was a member, but Eli Lilly. Mm-hmm. And if you remember, Eli Lilly had a patent granted to them for lysergic acid amide in 1956 that is useful in psychotherapy research because it elicits characteristic patterns of rage and hallucinations. So essentially this network, it deploys assets that can be used to manipulate the entire planet in terms of rewarding or holding back privileges to people, including prisoners, right, as in the Jerome Lemelson patent. And we were discussing just before the show started how dangerous that is, because it's not a human being saying to a prisoner, I will let you out of jail if you will kindly go and rape a little girl on Christmas Day in Boulder, Colorado. You've got a computer that says, I'll double your furlough or shorten your sentence if you can bring me a film of a little girl being tortured to death in Boulder, Colorado on Christmas Day. So it's how should I put it? It's a fifth column inside the human wheel, if you will. Wow. And so when a major crime happens, we were talking about the word disinhibited, I'm not sure necessarily if many people have heard of this, but for me, disinhibited means that there's no feedback from the pain and agony of your victim when you're torturing them to death. So I think we mentioned 4 great crimes that have not been solved in my book. There's the prostitute at the pig farm, the Picton pig farm in British Columbia, where women were tortured to death in front of an audience of 2,000 people at Friday night raves, sanctioned by the Canadian federal government through a registered society called Piggy Palace Good Time Society.
Wow.
Yeah, you got a picture of it there.
Then you have it was sanctioned by the Canadian government, David. That's
it was a federally registered society called Piggy Palace Good Time Society, and they were licensed to hold entertainment and sporting events on this damn pig farm. But it had been any kind of follow-up by the federal government, because when they're handing out charitable status, it's quite significant. They would have discovered that starting in 1996, prostitutes were being taken from the downtown east side of Vancouver out to the pig farm. There would be raves of up to 2,000 people invited, and they would watch these women apparently being tortured to death and then fed through a wood chipper.
Wow.
Well, how sick is that? You've got little John Benet Ramsey.
Yeah, it's very close to this
The important thing is, if I may say so, it's not a criticism. It's not crazy. It's lethally logical if you want to create a culture or a community embedded so deep in decent society that no one wants to talk about it because they're terrified.
It's interesting.
Then you have the Sherman murder.
Sorry, David.
What?
It's interesting that you describe it that way because, see, as you said, I learned things in real time on this show as well because I didn't know really about this Picton pig farm until you started telling me about it. And one of the things I find most interesting about it, this is the first time I've bothered to look at it on a 3D map, and it just seems so oddly incongruent with this nice, organized neighborhood of large houses right next to it.
Well, it was an agricultural property owned by the Picton family through 3 generations, and a number of very powerful and influential players wanted to develop the real estate in the area of that pig farm, and a number of the councillors in Port Coquitlam were objecting until they went out to the pig farm to a Friday night rave, and then of course they were compromised with film and extorted and blackmailed, and then you've got these real estate developments that have made a lot of money for a lot of people in the vicinity of prime agricultural land.
Wow. And the Washington Post described this Robert Picton as the worst serial killer in history who fed prostitutes to pigs.
Well, he did a lot worse than that. I mean, yeah, it's bad enough to be fed to a pig, but the point is to be tortured to death in front of an audience of 2,000 people. And you know what, Jason, that comes back to Mendenhalling, doesn't it? Remember the definition of Mendenhalling?
Absolutely.
You roll the party over to see the humiliation in their eyes, preferably in front of a large audience, right? So what this expert system, the Jerome Lemelson one, and I'm an expert in expert systems. I wrote a paper, you might be able to find it, in 1983 in the International Journal of Man-Machine Studies. It was published, my paper, An Analysis of Expert Thinking, right, by David Hawkins. And I was working at Schlumberger Doll Research Center in Ridgefield, Connecticut. I was working with, or Schlumberger had employed a couple of consultants in artificial intelligence. Obviously, they were very bright and capable people, but I looked at their model of human intelligence, and I realized it was inadequate in many, many ways. I developed my own theory and actually built working systems. So when I hear about this, yeah, there it is, an analysis of expert thinking, I'm kind of proud of that. I think I laid down the groundwork for analyzing human experts, and it was the basis, the philosophical basis for the expert systems I actually built. But in my recommendation or analysis of expert systems, I was 100% against the idea of providing the computer with the privileges of making moral or emotional or ethical decision. And to my horror, relatively recently, until I saw that Jerome Lemelson patent, I discovered that they probably tracked my work back in the 1980s,
Who did?
and then realized, sorry?
Who tracked your work?
Well, one of the consultants at Schlumberger was a man called Marvin Minsky, right, who was the artificial intelligence from MIT. And at MIT, there was a man who was fired by Clinton. And as I often say, to be fired by Clinton, you've got to be seriously evil. His name was John Deutsch. He was the former director of the CIA. He'd leaked about 9,000 pages of top secret CIA information to a house worker who I believe was a woman from the United Kingdom.
Well, now wait a minute. So we've got Marvin Minsky here. He's from MIT, and he was tracking your research, you say?
So Marvin Minsky was an artificial intelligence consultant at Schlumberger when I was coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience. So
Is
I
this
met him.
him right here?
Yes. All right. And I think he's
Odd-looking
passed away by now. Right?
He's
Sorry?
an odd-looking fellow, isn't he?
Well, anyone working in artificial intelligence has got to be pretty odd, right? No, but seriously, he was a very bright guy. I think his a framework for representing knowledge. That was kind of his theory. I won't go into the detail; it's too complex. But essentially, the paper that I wrote, I drew on the input from these two gentlemen, Marvin Minsky and Ed Feigenbaum from Stanford. I developed my own theory of artificial intelligence and expert thinking. And at the end of the paper, I said it's vitally important not to rely or give to the computer the right to make moral or ethical decisions about human beings, because no computer program can ever have compassion or empathy for a victim.
Right.
So what you see, these crime scenes, essentially, I don't know if people can grasp this, they're algorithmically driven, right? The computer is basically saying or giving them a set of instructions what to do at the Sherman crime scene, what to do at the pig farm crime scene, what to do at the John Benet Ramsey crime scene, what to do at the Gareth Williams crime scene, where the poor guy is folded three ways and put in a North Face sports bag with his backside poking out of the hole at the end. And I think he was, it's too hideous what they did to him. But in every one of these cases, there's no inhibition, right? There's no compassion. There's no empathy for the suffering of the victim. In fact, the suffering of the victim is an important part of this. So we now have permeated in our society, the one that we hold so dear, and we think that's so civilized. There is a hardcore of criminality that is rewarded for being criminal and being cruel.
Wow.
And until we rip that out of society, the whole situation is going to deteriorate. And this crash of the Lion Air plane, the Boeing off the Indonesia coast, it looks like it was an attitude of attack, hack of the electronics on that Boeing aircraft. And just to remind listeners, the British company Serco, that I think has played a major role in the 9/11 attack, is the preferred supplier of command control computers, communications and intelligence for the Boeing Aircraft Company, and was so on 9/11.
This is really the first I'm learning about this Lion Air crash, David. The Indonesian National Transport Safety Committee has indicated that Lion Air Flight 610 experienced erroneous input from one of its AOA sensors, angle of attack sensors. Boeing issues an operations manual bulletin directing operators to existing flight crew procedures to address circumstances where there's erroneous input from an AOA sensor. But David, I'm certainly not a pilot, and I know that you're not either, but if you're flying an airplane over the ocean in Indonesia at night or even during the day, if you have erroneous input from the sensors, how would you know that until it's too late?
Well, and you remember that my basic technique is whenever there's a rather odd description of a rather odd crash, then I go into the patent office or the listing or the description of the patent office to see if I can find any patent that might be in the custody of the perpetrators of a man-in-the-middle attack on that Boeing. And lo and behold, I've got Boeing companies aircraft non-normalized angle of attack indicating system. Priority date 1998, 12/11. Issued 2010-10. Should I give you the number and you can perhaps put it up?
Yeah, sure. I just put in Boeing non-normalized angle of attack, but sure, the patent number.
Yeah, and the patent number is US 613-1055A, right? And lo and behold, you got a precise description of what could be manipulated to give the pilots of that Boeing aircraft conflicting signals. And when Boeing says, I mean, these guys need their head shaking, well, we've issued instructions of what pilots should do if they're getting conflicting instructions in the operations manual for the plane. I'm saying, you know, suddenly you've got the plane is being switched into dive mode because and you're supposed to look up the damn operating manual. I mean, come on.
It does seem quite ridiculous, but here it is. Aircraft non-normalized angle of attack indicating system. It does seem very specific.
Right. So what you do is you attach that system as an input to an expert system on the Federal Bridge. You program the Federal Bridge to select rewards or privileges to people who can hack into an aircraft like that and present you with an opportunity to double the insurance on the hull of the thing while it's taking off.
Amazing.
Right. So the idea of a disembodied, and I've called it Malipod. Maybe we can go into that when we switch to the show, the Patreon show. But essentially what I'd like with this part of the conversation really is to indicate to people that the key to look for is there an expert system or an artificial intelligence algorithm that is sitting on these deep state networks that is actually rewarding people for criminal behavior. And my contention is there is, and it's been built not necessarily simply because of me, but I believe the people who developed this understood the importance of the work I did in the 1980s at Schlumberger Doll Research in Ridgefield. The paper that I'd written, an analysis of expert thinking, and they realized they could actually bypass the scientist and the engineer, which was me back then, and develop a system for controlling society by rewarding criminals.
Wow.
Through an algorithm.
David, that's amazing. Well, with that, David, I think it may be time for us to head over to Patreon. I definitely want to remind people that they should be sponsoring David on Patreon. Obviously, I could not do this show without him, and David is there at patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. And certainly if anyone is watching this on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, please become a sponsor of David as well. You know, David, just last week I was in California at Patreon's annual PatreCon, which is a confab where all of Patreon's top creators get together, and the CEO was there, various executives from the company. I was quite impressed with Patreon. The CEO, Jack Conte, is a very thoughtful guy. He was an independent musician who was frustrated with the monetization model on YouTube, and so he created Patreon out of necessity. And I'm sure you are quite familiar that necessity is always the mother of invention, and Jack Conte is definitely not some Silicon Valley, billionaire, MBA, programmer kind of guy who was trying to come up with the next billion-dollar unicorn to sell to Facebook or Google. This is a company that he treats like his baby, and he was very specific that he wanted it to remain independent. So I really appreciated that spirit. I think it's important that our viewers keep our news, keep our reporting, keep our research, our edutainment program also independent, and right now Patreon is an excellent way to do that. So please join David and I at patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and at patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, where we're going to carry on with this conversation right now.